I'm gonna be real. I'm gonna be very real. It's not. It's been very clear that I don't like Stephanie White as coach, Caitlin Clark. I made that clear a year ago. I was the first person.
I was the very first person to bring this up, and I want to make something crystal clear right out of the gate. That initial reaction, that is definitely not just some knee-jerk reaction to one single bad night on the court. Honestly, he called the Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark pairing a complete mistake a full year ago, way before anyone else was willing to say it out loud.
They blew out third quarter. But we gotta be real here. This was an 8-point game with 6 minutes to go. Caitlin Clark's third quarter turnovers did not lose them a game. That was an 8-point game with 6 minutes to go. Like, she hadn't turned the ball over in the second half until it was a 1-point game.
And then, fast forward to Saturday, June 20th, when the Indiana Fever stepped onto the court and essentially handed him an entirely fresh, undeniably massive stack of evidence to prove his point. We are talking about a brutal 113-96 blowout loss down in Atlanta that honestly sparked a wildfire of debate.
No, and look at Caitlin Clark's reaction here when she talks about what lost them the game.
I think it started with our turnovers. And we had 9 turnovers. They had 11 points off of those turnovers. You know, it's hard for us to recover when they get those direct points, and there's no transition defense.
Because depending entirely on who you ask in the basketball world right now, that disaster was either 100% all Caitlin Clark's fault, or it was barely her fault at all. So let's really set the scene here and paint a picture of how this game actually unfolded.
She, the coach, letting it be known to the public, letting it be known to your teammates that you are the reason we lost this game. Because you better believe Caitlin Clark is already blaming herself. Like, she's already blaming herself. And I'm going to be real here.
Early on, the Indiana Fever were actually looking solid. They led 44-33 deep into the second quarter and even managed to carry a respectable 3-point lead right into the halftime locker room, sitting pretty at 59-56. But then the second half started, and Atlanta absolutely exploded, dropping a devastating 28-15 run in the third quarter alone. From that moment on, the entire game plan completely came apart at the seams.
Yes, in a fan battle, it's always going to be, when they win, it's all Caitlin. When they lose, it's never Caitlin. But the problem is with the media, it's the opposite. When they win, it's all Kelsey Mitchell. And when they lose, it's all Caitlin. It's Kelsey Mitchell is the best player on the team until Kelsey Mitchell has 0 points in an entire half. And they lose that half. They completely get destroyed in that half.
Things got so bad that the Fever eventually found themselves trailing by a massive 22 points before finally limping away with a 17-point loss. Now, when you look at the stat sheet, Clark actually led absolutely everyone on the floor with an impressive 26 points and 7 assists, but the glaring issue was that she also turned the basketball over 7 different times. And as you might expect with the intense media scrutiny surrounding her, almost instantly, the entire mainstream story completely ignored her scoring and became entirely focused on those turnovers.
Getting cooked by everyone in that first half. The fact is that the Indiana Fever were pathetic on defense in the first half. And if the Indiana Fever had played any sort of decent defense, they go into the second half up 18 points, and this game is different. Like, if they concede, even if they concede 40, 45.
That right there is the team's head coach, literally just moments after the final buzzer sounded, stepping up to the microphone and going straight to criticizing the team's giveaways. Now look, to be completely fair to her in this specific situation, the number is definitely real and impossible to ignore. The Indiana offense coughed up the basketball a staggering 10 times in that disastrous third quarter alone, and yes, unfortunately, Clark was directly responsible for exactly half, 5 of those incredibly costly turnovers.
True on Damaris Dantas start the fourth quarter when it was in crunch time, and you put on Ty Harris with 7 minutes to go for Kelsey Mitchell. You pull Kelsey, it's an 8-point game with 7 minutes to go, and you pull Kelsey Mitchell. Like, I've never heard Stephanie White say, I made a wrong decision. I made a wrong read.
But here is what you have to respect about the rookie. Clark absolutely did not dodge the issue or try to hide from the criticism whatsoever. She stood right there, looked directly at the reporters, and flat out told them that they simply have to take care of the basketball much better, and she explicitly admitted that fixing the issue completely starts with her. So, at the end of the day, both the head coach and the star player publicly named the turnover problem.
But it's been 2 years. Stephanie White has not criticized her system once. She's not criticized her coaching decisions once. And every coach I know, especially a coach that is reactionary who constantly changes their game plans, every single coach has said, look, I got the game plan wrong. At least once in their career. I messed up the game plan.
However, let me break down why this is causing such a massive stir. The core problem here really isn't simply that turnovers happened on the court. Turnovers are just a natural part of basketball. The actual problem, the one that is making everyone so furious, is entirely about what a coach deliberately chooses to put on the public record for the media to feast on, and even more importantly, what she strategically chooses to leave entirely off that very same record.
I get it. I think they like each other as people. There is no worse fit as far as coaches and player is concerned than Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark. And it's this weird thing in the WNBA because they don't dislike each other as people. That therefore they have to continually play with each other. No, it's like Mike D'Antoni coaching Kobe Bryant. It just didn't work. Mike D'Antoni was an unbelievable coach. Kobe Bryant was one of the greatest of all time. It didn't work. It just didn't work. Anyway.
Now listen, because this is the specific part that actually matters more than anything else. And honestly, absolutely anyone who has ever competed in team sports at any serious level intuitively understands exactly what is going on here. When a head coach steps right up to a live microphone and immediately points the finger directly at turnovers, while conveniently never once criticizing her own offensive scheme, her own rotation choices, or her team's absolutely non-existent defense, the general public does the mental math in about 2 seconds flat. They hear 9 turnovers, they see the 11 points, and they instantly form a narrative. Caitlin Clark, connect the dots. To be clear, he is absolutely not sitting here trying to argue that Stephanie White straight up lied to the press or the fans. What he is actually saying is that she intentionally let a deeply negative narrative land squarely on the shoulders of her absolute best player, and she did absolutely nothing at all to step in and catch it. And the crazy thing is, this isn't even the first time the television cameras have clearly caught some serious friction between these two. Just a week earlier, in an incredibly frustrating 16-point loss to the brand new expansion team, the Portland Fire, White inexplicably pulled Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Lexi Hull from the game with 6.5 minutes still left in the first quarter, despite the fact that Indiana was actually up 8-2 at the time. Well, you can guess what happened next. Portland immediately ripped off a massive scoring run. The Fever's momentum completely died and they never recovered, and a wildly intense sideline exchange between Clark and White went so incredibly viral across every single social media platform that the team's front office actually felt forced to call a completely mandatory air-clearing meeting first thing that following Monday morning. But now, let's take a second and completely flip this whole situation around, because he really makes a profoundly sharp, critical point about how the sports media coverage surrounding this team actually works in reality. If you look closely at the toxic fan wars constantly raging online, you'll see that absolutely every single win is credited solely to Clark, while no loss ever seems to stick to her. But when you switch gears and look at a whole lot of the official mainstream media framing, the narrative runs in the completely opposite direction entirely. Take Kelsey Mitchell, for example. She constantly gets praised by analysts as the true driving engine of this Indiana team, and don't get me wrong, she is absolutely a legitimate, high-level star, a verified 5,000-point career scorer who quite literally hung a spectacular 25 points on this exact same Atlanta team just a few weeks back on June 4th. But if we are being honest about Saturday's performance, Mitchell went an incredibly rough 5 for 13 from the floor, contributing just 16 very quiet points, and she was visibly rattled enough by the pressure that she actually picked up a completely unnecessary technical foul alongside Sophie Cunningham. Yet, incredibly, when Mitchell completely vanishes for massive stretches of a crucial game like that, you will never see a major headline that loudly reads, "Mitchell struggles." Instead, the headline across the entire sports world quietly and predictably becomes, "Clark turns it over," yet again. It is the exact same team, playing in the exact same painful loss. Yet we are seeing a completely different level of public accountability, strictly depending on which number happens to be printed on the back of the jersey. And honestly, this right here is the specific argument that I firmly believe holds the absolute most weight in this entire debate. Mainly because it is the exact uncomfortable truth that absolutely nobody sitting on that official television broadcast actually wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole. If we just totally forget about that disastrous third quarter for one single second, and instead actually look closely at what Indiana's overall defense was doing for the entire night, it is an absolute nightmare. I mean, we are talking about a scenario where the Atlanta Dream literally set a brand new all-time franchise record for total points scored in a single game. When you look at the raw stats, Ryan Howard absolutely poured in an effortless 24 points. Alicia Gray stepped up and added another incredibly efficient 22 points, and Angel Reese went off for 18 points and 8 boards, officially becoming the fastest player in the entire history of the WNBA to reach an astonishing 1,000 career rebounds in just her 79th professional game. Now remember, this was actually their second straight, deeply frustrating loss to the Dream in a span of just 3 days, right after Indiana had already dropped a highly contested 108-101 shootout game earlier that Thursday. Let me be perfectly clear. You absolutely do not surrender 113 points and then another 108 points to the exact same basketball team in a single week simply because your point guard accidentally threw 5 bad passes away during one isolated quarter. The harsh reality is that you surrender those kinds of astronomically high point totals simply because your team fundamentally cannot get a crucial stop when it actually matters. At the end of the day, the offensive turnovers that everyone won't stop talking about were merely a glaring symptom of a much larger issue. The team's structurally broken, completely unorganized defense was the actual underlying disease that killed them on the court. And honestly, for whatever it is actually worth to the endless critics analyzing the film out there, Clark was objectively nowhere near being the single worst defender on that end of the floor during this specific matchup. And then, of course, we absolutely have to talk about the deeply questionable in-game decision-making from the sidelines, which is exactly where his very valid frustration with this entire situation really begins to sharpen. He specifically zeroes in on one incredibly confusing stretch of the game where head coach Stephanie White decides to pull Kelsey Mitchell incredibly late in the fourth quarter, despite the fact that the game was actually still very much within striking distance. I mean, think about it. You literally made the deliberate choice to sit your most reliable veteran scorer squarely on the bench right in the middle of absolute crunch time. Now maybe, just maybe, there is some incredibly complex, highly specific defensive reason for making a substitution like that in such a pivotal moment. Maybe there is a hyper-specific player matchup she was desperately trying to exploit on the floor, but no matter how you try to slice it, a move like that absolutely raises a massive eyebrow for anyone watching, and honestly, it raises that eyebrow even higher when you step back and start to remember the repeating pattern here. White actually has a very well-documented, undeniable preference throughout this entire season for actively trying to run the team's offense at a much faster pace by putting Raven Johnson at the starting point guard position instead. In fact, during one of the recent games, a live television broadcaster even officially relayed to the audience that the coaching staff genuinely feels that the entire team is somehow significantly quicker and more fluid whenever Johnson is the one initiating the offensive sets. Now take that little piece of inside information and directly layer it on top of the much bigger, overarching schematic shift we've all been witnessing firsthand. White has deliberately and systematically moved Clark much more into an off-the-ball position this entire year, aggressively pulling her far away from the incredibly high-usage, brilliantly ball-dominant role that she absolutely mastered and dominated in during her legendary run at Iowa, which is exactly what made her the undisputed 2024 Rookie of the Year in the first place. Sure, on some highly specific nights, when the shots happen to be falling, that awkward adjustment actually looks somewhat fine, and the team manages to get by. But on this past Saturday night, It was painfully obvious that Clark absolutely never once managed to find a comfortable shooting rhythm after those first few fleeting opening minutes of the first quarter. The Atlanta defense aggressively crowded her physical space every single time she even thought about touching the basketball, and as a direct result, the entire Indiana offense completely sputtered and ground to a horrific, unwatchable halt. To be perfectly clear here, his ultimate point in pointing all of this out isn't to boldly claim that absolutely every single sideline call this coaching staff made was 100% objectively wrong. What he is really trying to highlight is the glaring, undeniable fact that throughout all of these deeply frustrating losses and questionable adjustments, he has literally never once heard this particular head coach step up to a microphone and actually say the simple words, "I messed up, I got that read completely wrong tonight." And frankly, that specific lack of ownership is exactly the central thread that is currently running deep through absolutely everything going wrong with this team right now. We are talking about basic, fundamental accountability at the highest level of professional sports. Literally every single great coach who is actually worth holding their tactical clipboard eventually has to stand up in front of the press and say some variation of the phrase, "Listen guys, the failure of tonight's game plan is entirely on me." Yet, according to his incredibly accurate telling of the situation, White absolutely has not done that even one single time this entire season. Remember when those deeply confusing Portland substitutions completely blew up in her face and cost them the game? Her only public explanation was casually brushing it off by claiming that it was simply the team's typical rotation pattern and that she was just trying to safely manage Aaliyah Boston's physical workload. And when that heated, incredibly intense sideline clip of her and Clark went massively viral across the internet, she immediately pivoted and completely reframed the entire situation as simply challenging a star player, quickly pointing to a perceived societal double standard, and arguing that absolutely nobody in the media ever questions a coach getting in a player's face when it happens during a men's sports broadcast. Now, before we go any further down this rabbit hole, this is exactly the moment where basic fairness actually demands that we all take a collective pause and look at the bigger picture. We need to be explicitly clear here. Stephanie White is absolutely not a bad basketball coach by any stretch of the imagination. We are talking about a highly experienced woman whose meticulously crafted teams have literally reached the league semifinals for 3 consecutive, incredibly competitive seasons. A leader who successfully dragged this very same Indiana franchise all the way to the grand finals way back in 2015. And importantly, someone who currently stands as the reigning, undisputed Commissioner's Cup champion. Furthermore, if you look at the immediate schedule, barely 2 short weeks before this massive, highly publicized Saturday night collapse even happened, her Indiana Fever squad actually played phenomenal defense and held this exact same Atlanta Dream Team to an absolute season low in scoring, comfortably walking away with a dominant 12-point victory. So all of this wild conspiratorial idea currently floating around the darkest corners of social media, claiming that White is somehow intentionally, maliciously trying to sabotage Clark's rookie season, has absolutely zero factual evidence behind it. And every single serious sports outlet that has actually sat down and rigorously reviewed the game footage has publicly said as much. Therefore, we can definitively say that the core issue at play here was never actually about a lack of pure basketball competence. No, the real, much more complicated issue at hand is actively questioning whether raw basketball competence, when forcefully combined with absolutely zero public accountability from the head coaching position, can actually manage to survive long-term while standing directly inside the absolute brightest, most unforgiving media spotlight that this professional league has ever seen in its entire history. Anyway, moving past the rumor mill, that specific, highly calculated historical comparison he makes right there is, without a doubt, the single smartest, most insightful thing he says during this entire broadcast. Think back to the legendary NBA days. Mike the 500th Antony was universally respected as an absolutely brilliant, generationally transformative offensive mind who literally changed the way the game of basketball was played on a fundamental level. At the exact same time, Kobe Bryant was undeniably one of the absolute greatest, most lethal basketball players who ever lived and stepped foot on a hardwood court. But when the front office decided to put both of those incredible basketball geniuses into the exact same building and ask them to work together, it produced absolutely almost nothing of real value. Simply because raw brilliance plus more raw brilliance fundamentally does not add up to winning championships when those two individuals possess completely different, fiercely clashing visions for how the game should be played. And honestly, that deeply frustrating clash of visions is the exact same dangerous trap that the Indiana Fever organization is currently sitting directly in right now. Let's be as clear as possible. Stephanie White absolutely isn't some sort of tactical fraud who tricked her way into the league. And Caitlin Clark obviously isn't the root problem destroying this offense either. The absolute hardest truth for fans to swallow here is that they can both be genuinely excellent, historically great basketball minds, and yet still be the entirely wrong schematic fit for each other, which is frankly a far more difficult and deeply uncomfortable conclusion for everyone to accept than simply screaming "fire the coach" or endlessly tweeting "the rookie always chokes." Mostly because this specific reality means there is absolutely no clear, satisfying villain to point our fingers at. So I urge you to really stop the name-calling and actually think incredibly deeply about exactly what the actual statistical evidence currently points to on paper. Right now, as the standings currently sit, the Indiana Fever rank a dismal second place in the entire professional league when it comes to total turnovers, frustratingly giving the basketball away more than 15 times on any given night they step onto the floor. And let me tell you something important. That specific metric is definitely not just some random player error statistic. That is a fundamental system stat, an incredibly revealing spacing stat, and a massive, flashing red light that tells us exactly who has the ball in their hands and precisely why the current offense is failing so miserably. Because when you stubbornly decide to take your absolute most incredibly gifted, visionary passer completely off the ball, aggressively ask her to play a rigid system role she has literally never once played in her entire basketball life, and yet the team's giveaways still remain absolutely sky-high anyway, you have to realize something is fundamentally broken. What that deeply flawed turnover data tells you is that the current coaching scheme is aggressively asking a highly complex tactical question that the current roster personnel fundamentally cannot physically answer on the floor, and unfortunately, the deeply emotional, mental human cost of that specific disconnect is exactly the vital part that constantly gets completely lost in all this toxic internet noise. After that brutal game, Clark literally stood directly at that brightly lit media podium, looked the cameras in the eye, and bravely put the entire crushing weight of that terrible loss directly onto her own rookie shoulders. "It all entirely starts with me," she bravely told the completely silent room of reporters. She then went on to brilliantly and meticulously explain exactly how the constant, undisciplined fouls completely killed their fast-paced transition game, breaking down how the moment you are endlessly sending the opposing team to the free throw line, you fundamentally cannot run the floor anymore, and running the open floor in transition is the exact high-octane style of offense that she was literally genetically built to dominate in. Listen to me very closely. That is precisely what it looks like when a rookie player is forced into doing the veteran head coach's public relations job for her, actively naming the exact schematic breakdown on the floor, deeply owning her own specific piece of the resulting failure, and fiercely protecting the fragile morale of her own locker room from the waiting media vultures. Frankly, the absolute bare minimum, least demanding thing a professional head coach can possibly do in return for that kind of profound loyalty is to bravely stand up at that exact same podium and publicly say that the disastrous giveaways were an absolute failure on absolutely everyone involved. She should be standing up there acknowledging the reality of the game, admitting that the incredibly porous team defense literally allowed an opposing franchise to set an all-time historical scoring record in their own building, and finally confessing that, hey, some of these terrible reads and adjustments out there tonight were completely on me. It is literally just one single, completely reasonable sentence of basic accountability, yet, for whatever deeply ingrained, stubborn reason, she absolutely will not say it under any circumstances. Now, having laid all of that out, here is the entirely valid, highly logical counterargument from the other side of the aisle, and I promise you, it is a very real, incredibly serious one. So I want you to just sit quietly with it for a moment and really think it through. In all practical reality, what exactly is Stephanie White actually supposed to do differently in these high-pressure, late-game scenarios? Is she honestly supposed to aggressively bench Caitlin Clark entirely during the most crucial, final stretch of incredibly close games just because of a few bad passes? We all inherently know that is an absolute, undeniable non-starter in today's basketball climate. Just try to imagine for one single second the absolute apocalyptic media reaction and raging fan meltdown if the league's single biggest, most profitable box office draw is inexplicably glued firmly to the sideline bench during the most critical, highly viewed final minutes of a primetime television broadcast. And what are her other options? Is she supposed to completely stop carefully managing Aaliyah Boston's incredibly crucial physical minutes over the course of a grueling, incredibly demanding months-long professional season? Because the reality of the situation is that Aaliyah Boston's long-term physical health absolutely matters tremendously to the future success of this entire franchise. And let me just aggressively reiterate this point so it is crystal clear. All of that ridiculous, toxic sabotage talk constantly circulating online right now absolutely deserves to be picked up and thrown out into the garbage entirely. There is absolutely zero legitimate evidence, I mean literally none whatsoever in existence, that any professional head coach in this league is actively, intentionally trying to torpedo the career of her very own generational superstar just for the sake of petty jealousy. Furthermore, Stephanie White's most loyal defenders in the sports media will very quickly and accurately point out to you that this specific team is currently sitting at a very respectable 9-7 overall record, that they are literally the proud, defending Commissioner's Cup reigning champions, and that simply suffering two undeniably ugly, frustrating losses to a completely red-hot, firing on all cylinders Atlanta squad in the span of a single week is simply a rough stretch of the schedule, definitely not some massive, franchise-altering referendum on the entire coaching staff. And honestly, absolutely all of that contextual defense is completely fair and perfectly reasonable to bring up in this debate. But I want you to really zoom in and closely consider the actual chronological sequence of events that took place. Because when you actually break down the timeline, it profoundly sharpens his critical point even further and makes it entirely impossible to ignore. This deeply embarrassing performance simply wasn't just one isolated, uncharacteristically bad night happening inside a totally random vacuum of the regular season. The reality is that Indiana embarrassingly lost to this exact same Atlanta team on a Thursday night, and then they were miraculously handed a perfect golden opportunity for a complete do-over against the entirely identical roster just 48 incredibly short hours later. They were facing the exact same opposing personnel on the floor, dealing with the exact same offensive and defensive tendencies, and the coaching staff had an entirely full, dedicated film session in between those two games to figure things out. And yet somehow, they managed to lose by an even wider, far more humiliating point margin the second time around. Look, when you face the exact same professional opponent twice in a mere 3 days, and your performance in the second game is demonstrably significantly worse than the very first one, that is absolutely the clearest, most undeniable possible litmus test of whether or not the coaching staff is actually making the necessary tactical adjustments, and I have to tell you, the final scoreboard returned an absolutely brutal, completely unforgiving answer to that question. Ultimately, yes, it is true that the players on the floor are the ones who must physically execute the game plan. But you can never forget the most important part of that equation. Somebody sitting on that sideline actually has to grab the whiteboard and brilliantly draw that strategic plan up in the first place. Yet, absolutely none of the endless, passionate defenses being thrown around by the media right now actually managed to change or resolve the deep, underlying core tension ripping through this locker room. And honestly, It is precisely that massive unresolved friction that makes this exact situation the single most incredibly fascinating, completely unmissable dramatic storyline currently unfolding anywhere in the entire sport right now. We have to acknowledge the absolute historic reality that the WNBA has quite literally never, in its entire multi-decade existence, experienced a blinding, utterly overwhelming media spotlight, quite like the massive phenomenon that Caitlin Clark currently brings to absolutely every single arena she enters. Just look at the raw numbers. Saturday's roaring crowd was a staggering 17,044 screaming fans, utterly packed to the absolute rafters inside a massive building that the Atlanta Dream doesn't even normally play their regular season home games in this completely unprecedented new environment. The high-definition television cameras are actively catching absolutely every single tense sideline huddle, every single frustrated hand thrown up in the air in disgust, and absolutely every single sideways passive-aggressive glance directed toward the coaching bench. And let me tell you exactly what happens in that specific, hyper-focused environment. A head coach who constantly deflects all meaningful criticism, who absolutely never steps up to publicly own even a single flawed tactical decision, and who passively just lets all the toxic blame slowly drift directly toward the single most heavily scrutinized, overanalyzed athlete in the entire history of women's basketball. Well, that specific coach is ultimately going to get completely swallowed whole by the exact same massive, profitable media attention that is currently making this entire professional league so incredibly rich in the first place. Frankly, at this newly elevated level of intense mainstream scrutiny, it almost doesn't even matter how incredibly strong or historically decorated a coach's past championship resume actually happens to be. The fundamental core job description for a head coach in this league has permanently, irreversibly changed overnight, and that tired, outdated old playbook consisting entirely of giving vague, highly defensive, absolutely no-fault press conferences simply does not and cannot survive first contact with this absolute massive, blinding amount of new media daylight. So let's just go ahead and strip this entire complicated narrative all the way down to the absolute bare, undeniable facts of the situation. Yes, there is zero doubt that Caitlin Clark was a very real, tangible part of exactly why the Indiana Fever looked so incredibly bad out there on the court this past Saturday night. I mean, facts are facts, and throwing 5 completely unforced turnovers in a single, disastrous quarter is always going to be 5 absolutely terrible turnovers in a quarter no matter how you try to slice it. And honestly, judging by her post-game press conference, she would be the very first person in the entire building to look you in the eye and readily admit that harsh truth to you. But you cannot ignore the flip side of that same coin, because she was also the absolute, undeniable primary reason that the team even managed to build a competitive lead that they were capable of blowing in the first place. She was quite literally the sole offensive engine and the only real reason they were even remotely within striking distance during those early, highly contested minutes of the basketball game. Honestly, trying to solely blame her for the entirety of this catastrophic loss is completely absurd. It is exactly like stubbornly blaming the isolated goalkeeper for a devastating match where his entirely broken defense just allowed the opposing team to effortlessly score 5 massive, uncontested goals right in front of his face while he stood there helpless. Make no mistake about what we all watched with our own eyes. That massive second-half collapse was an absolute, systemic team collapse, an undeniable defensive collapse of epic proportions, and yes, without a shadow of a doubt, a glaring coaching collapse on the sidelines, and yet somehow, miraculously, only one of those 3 specific elements constantly keeps getting a completely free, unquestioned pass from the broader media establishment, all of which ultimately brings everything completely back around to the absolute only defining question that truly matters moving forward for this franchise. If you sit there and genuinely, deeply believe in your heart that Stephanie White is absolutely the single right tactical coach to fully maximize the generational, once-in-a-lifetime talent of Caitlin Clark, then I challenge you to definitively tell me exactly how she is going to pull it off. Explicitly name the precise tactical adjustment she needs to make, outline the exact offensive scheme that will unlock this roster, and visually show me the actual functional version of this current system where it all finally just clicks into place. Conversely, if you truly think this entire situation is just exactly like Mike the 500th and Tony and Kobe Bryant all over again, meaning two undeniably great, historically brilliant basketball talents who were simply, fundamentally never built to harmoniously fit together on the same sideline, then you need to have the courage to just say that brutal truth completely out loud, because the Fever's front office executives are inevitably going to have to make that exact franchise-altering million-dollar call vastly sooner than absolutely anyone sitting in Indiana actually wants to admit right now. Ultimately, you just don't get to cowardly have it both ways in this league. At the end of the day, either the incredibly complex piece of the puzzle finally fits, or it completely shatters and just doesn't. So I want you to head down below and drop exactly where you firmly land on this massive debate directly into the comments section, because I promise you that I actually sit down and read absolutely every single one of them. And I already know for a verified fact that this specific, highly controversial topic is completely going to split the entire room right straight down the middle into two warring camps. And hey, if you have literally just been sitting there aggressively arguing right back at your computer or phone screen for the entire last 17 minutes of this video, I want you to know that that exact kind of passionate, fiery energy is exactly what keeps this entire channel growing and going strong day after day. So do me a huge favor and smash that like button and make sure you hit subscribe before you click away. We are currently actively chasing that massive 60K subscriber milestone right now, and apparently, based on the comments section, we are definitely getting there one incredibly furious, completely dedicated Indiana Fever fan at a time. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll absolutely see you guys in the next breakdown.